What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the Digital Mapmakers Academy. I'm Paul Postal, and today we are wrapping up our exploration of Photoshop using Photoshop to make fantasy maps with Kell from Kellerica Maps. There's a lot of good tips inside the episode today, so let's go ahead, let's get into it.
So so I think this is probably something that not everyone does, but I personally tend to leave the shading of things like mountains and the other things. Basically, I only start to do that after I've already added some color and texture. I just find that it's a bit easier to just kind of see what I'm doing. Now, I generally have two different ways of doing this. Sometimes I add the shading, all of the shading, just on top of the textures, and sometimes I add it below them. Generally, highlighting I always do on top of the textures. Shading sometimes do below it. But I think for this one I might just go for the use all of it above it. So I'm just gonna create a new folder called shading.
Okay.
And I'm gonna give this a yellow color. Just it's easier to keep track of it. And now this I appreciate is something that, again, as I said, I use a lot of masks. I use a lot of masks even at times when I probably wouldn't necessarily need to. So I actually tend to do my shading with masks as well. So I'm going to fill an entire layer with color. Then I'm going to create a mask.
Okay.
I'm going to hide everything. And I'm just going to be using the mask to actually paint the shading in rather than just to paint it the more or less old-fashioned way. Shading, I generally do just use, I do have a very large collection of different brushes that I've kind of made over the years. But for shading, I generally tend to just use something very basic.
Okay.
Like this. I think I'm just gonna turn that a little smaller. Adjust the opacity a little more. Obviously, this is exactly the kind of thing where having a good tablet makes all of the difference. So I'm just gonna kind of start adding a bit of shading. And once I do actually have something on it, then I'm gonna move on to the layer styles panel to actually work on the actual shades that I want to use. So first of all, I'm gonna turn the fill down to 0 because I do not want the original black that I have there to shine through. And then I'm just gonna use a color overlay. And again, this is something that you obviously can not do it as complicated. This one, I just find that using a color overlay on a layer rather than just like picking a color and just painting on a layer, it just allows for greater flexibility where if and when I want to tweak it and I want to tweak the shades. So I'm gonna choose something.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Something like, yeah, I'm just gonna choose something like multiply again and kind of just find a shade that I think works with the textures that I already have. So I think I'm gonna go for something a bit more brown tinted. And I kind of do want to have my shading be kind of subtle. So I don't want to, probably that's a bit too subtle, but it's like definitely not anything like this.
Right.
Just kind of want to just do something that's, so let's say something like that. Just
I see what you're doing. Okay. That looks really good. That's brilliant.
I generally kind of find that the more subtle, the better. Kind of obviously trying to do this as quickly as I can, since I don't want to necessarily spend like the next 8 hours here, but
No problem.
like, yeah, obviously this is something that if I have more time on my hands, I probably would actually do this like zoomed into this level just so I can nitpick my way through the entire map. Just kind of trying to keep it general enough for the sake of being brief. Just like kind of add some subtle shading here and there to kind of just make it look a bit more three-dimensional.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I think shading is really important. And I'm looking at the maps or the mountains rather in the bottom, and compared to the ones up top, and yeah, you can absolutely see the difference and how the shading makes the mountains pop out.
Yeah, it definitely does. And I think the thing that always surprises me even more than the shading is the highlighting, because that's what I'm gonna add next. And because it's very hard to sometimes even tell that the highlights are there, but it's very easy to tell when they're not there. It's just one of those things that you kind of it looks more natural when they're there, and then it just looks really weird and jarring when they're not. Yeah, there we go. That's a little bit of basic shading, and I think I'm also gonna add a little bit of that to the trees. I'm just gonna give them. Okay, I think I need a smaller brush for this. For this one, I actually will zoom in a bit closer, just so I see what I'm doing.
I see what you're talking about here, because looking at the difference in the trees on the right that you're about to shade right now, and then looking at the ones on the left, you're right. It's you don't really see and notice that it's there, but you can definitely tell when it's not. You're absolutely correct.
Yeah. Do you find it interesting how this seems to vary a lot for different artists? Which way do they find to be the more natural one for light to come from? I tend to always have my shadows be on this side.
Right.
But I do also know that some artists always go for the other one.
Yeah, I think that's just a matter of just personal preference and style. And I think this is one of the things that's the difference between using a program like Photoshop and using something like WonderDraft. I've used WonderDraft extensively, and it's good for what it does. But there are some things I wish I could do in WonderDraft or Incarnate or other programs I've used that, even though you have the steep learning curve with Photoshop, for people who are willing to, work through the learning curve and keep at it, you can have some amazing results, and you've got much more control over what you're doing than using a standard program.
But of course, the downside of that also is just the fact that a lot of what I do basically just draw a lot of my stuff just freehand, and that's unfortunately the kind of thing where you either are willing to put the time and effort into trying to learn that, or you're not. Like, I know a lot of people who just do not enjoy drawing in the more traditional sense, and that's fine. Like, that's completely understandable. And I honestly don't necessarily think that drawing things has ever really been my strongest suit when it comes to art. But it's kind of I just got too frustrated of not having access to the kind of resources that I wanted in order to kind of be able to, because you obviously can get like things like pre-made brush packs, even Photoshop, of like mountains and trees and such, but it's kind of just at some points, if you just don't get the specific kind of things that you need, you kind of, the only option that you're left with is to do them yourself.
Sure.
I appreciate that can be a turn off if you're not really like into that kind of thing. Okay, I think that's my rough shading in place. So next I'm gonna move on to the highlighting. I'm basically gonna do the same thing again. I'm gonna fill a layer. I'm just gonna call this one.
I'm interested to see this step because I'm curious as to what exactly is you're going to be highlighting.
So call this highlights. It's very important to keep your layers labeled and named correctly and organized. I'm sure everyone who's ever worked with Photoshop has at some point found themselves in a stage where they just suddenly have like 38 different layers that you have no idea what's on them, and they just...
Oh, I've done that. I've done that where I've forgotten to label my layers, and I'm sitting there clicking the eyeball icon so I can to see what disappears, so I can figure out what the layer was.
Yep. So this, and again, I'm gonna turn the fill down to 0. I'm gonna set a color. This time I'm gonna do overlay, and I'm gonna, but this one I think I'm actually gonna go for something that's almost white. But
so is overlay, is that just is exactly what it sounds like? It's just putting an overlay over the image.
Yes.
Okay. And so this kind of is what you see is what you get. You're just putting a color overlay on there. Okay.
This is where you really kind of start to get the map looking a bit more 3D.
I see that. Okay. Because the purpose of the shading and the overlay, I mean shading and the highlighting is just like you're saying, to make the map pop out a little bit more, look a little bit more three-dimensional, and come up off the page.
Exactly.
Yeah.
With this, I often do find that I actually might end up turning the opacity of the final thing down a little, so it doesn't stand out too much. But it's just right, especially now that I'm still working on it, it's just a bit easier to see when it actually is a bit more pronounced than I probably will want the final thing to be. Just so I can see what I'm doing.
So when you talk about the opacity there, so you've got the highlighting all on one layer. So when you adjust the opacity, it's adjusting the opacity for all of the highlighting, correct?
Pretty much. For bigger maps, I might actually end up separating things like the mountain highlights on a different layer. Like whenever I do work on bigger pieces, I do find it a bit easier to kind of just keep things separated, so I have greater control over them. But for the sake of simplicity, I'm just trying not to cram my file into a
Gotcha. Okay.
300 layer monstrosity that they normally are. Nobody wants to see that. As you can see, I'm very much not the most systematic of artists. I do have a bad habit of just kind of jumping all over the file. I should just be consistent and actually start from one spot and work my way from there. But nope, I shade this tree and then I suddenly jump to shade this tree, and it's just one of those. I actually do have ADD, so you can sometimes kind of just see how my brain makes these weird jumps.
I find myself doing the same thing when I'm working either in Photoshop or another application that, you know, I'm jumping around, and then like an hour later, I'll see the part that I meant to get to, and it's like, oh, I forgot to get to that part, so then I get back to that. But yeah, I do the same thing. But, you know, the fact that, you know, you have told me that sometimes getting a like for a commission map done can take you hours, you know, to get it completely done. So the fact that you have the fortitude to sit and for maybe a couple hours at a time and work on this is amazing. And I'm sure that probably what you do is what I have to do sometimes. I'm working on something creative, is I have to leave and come back to it and get a fresh set of eyes on it.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
But thankfully with commission work, it usually is kind of naturally balanced, because I do also want to be sending make sure the client is happy with how it's going. So I kind of do often run into a point where I've gotten to a certain spot, and then I'm like, okay, you know what? Before I spend any more time on this, I want to make sure that the client is happy with this, because like I don't want to, for instance, like do a huge amount of like things like make trees, and then spend the next 4 hours making trees only for like the client to come back. Actually, could we do a different style of tree? And then I'm just like, it's just better to do a few trees and then ask the client if he likes them, and then rather than just spend an insane amount of time just doing something that you might end up having to redo. So kind of like having to keep the client up to date with how the map is going can often be a very kind of natural way of just like balancing the work.
I'm sure
that way that you don't get.
I'm sure that was a hard lesson to learn at some point when you started doing commission work.
Yeah, that's probably something that a lot of people who kind of get into the habit of doing things for like doing art for other people.
Sure.
And I think also just sometimes it's also about kind of learning to also remembering that the client is the judge, like kind of the final judge of when they like it, because sometimes you do just get times when the client kind of asks you to edit something that you personally thought was better the other way around, or
Right.
or like, but also just sometimes like you do something that you're personally not terribly thrilled about, and then you send that to the client and the client loves it, like they think it's amazing, and then it's kind of okay, you know what, that's like the client is happy, that's the one that matters. I like, and then you kind of just have to suppress your natural artist urge to go in and redo everything because you're not happy with it.
Sure.
But that is kind of what. Oh, sorry. Yeah, carry on.
No, I'm sorry. Have you considered making just small map assets for other people to use? Like, for example, WonderDraft, because it's so open source that there's been times I've gone on websites and I have found free, and I've paid for some map assets that I've downloaded and used in WonderDraft. Like, people have made like volcanoes or different mountains or a style of tree or a way to draw a forest. So is that something that you have ever considered?
Actually working on a brush pack of sorts right now. That is definitely something that I have considered and I'm actually working on, but unfortunately that's still very much a work in progress that I try to find some time whenever I'm not doing too many commissions, which is not that often, which I guess is good. But
that is good. Job security.
Yeah. Exactly. But yeah, that is definitely something that I have been thinking about and I'm actually working on right now. So
good.
It's probably something that will also show up on my website at some point.
Well, this is looking really good. I mean, the mountains and the shading and the highlighting you put in here, especially with the little shadows on the trees that I would never have thought of. I mean, it's looking really good. It's just, it really made it from what we started with, just popping right off the page, which is great.
I think I actually did miss a tree here. Yep, I did. There we go. So yeah, that's kind of already looking a lot more. Just compare. This is what we started with, and well, actually, yes. I suppose like this is what we started with.
Wow.
We're kind of, yeah. Yeah, obviously this is the kind of thing where like I could spend like more time on this, and I like, because I'm me, I probably would, but maybe this should give a little bit of an idea of kind of like how I generally work with shading and textures. So I think we could just leave it at that.
Okay. Where can people find you if they want to hire you to do a commission for them?
Probably my website is the best place to reach me. It has a has both my email listed and a handy little contact form that you can use if you so desire. So I'm sure you can link that below, but basically kellericamaps.com is where you can find me.
Okay. And then finally, is there any shout outs you want to give to anybody?
Basically, if you are an aspiring map maker, please do come to check out the Cartographers Guild forum. It is a wonderful community of very talented artists, and it's just a great place to learn. It has tons of tutorials available, and yeah, we just love to have any new map makers.
Awesome.
To join us. So.
Well, Kell, again, thank you very much for joining me on the Digital Mapmakers Academy. And if you're so inclined and this was a good experience for you, I would love to have you back on another episode to maybe focus on something else when it comes to map making. But we'll go ahead and wrap this up and let you get on with your day. So once again, just want to thank you for joining me, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Sure. So this wraps up part 3 of our series of exploring fantasy map making with Kell from Kellerica Maps. Many thanks to Kell for showing us how to use Photoshop to shade and to highlight our maps. If you did like this episode, please feel free to subscribe, and don't forget to click the dingy bell so you'll be notified when a new video is released. If you do have a favorite map maker you'd like to see on the show, please feel free to let me know in the comments below, and I'll be more than happy to reach out to them and see if I can get them on the channel. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time on the Digital Mapmakers Academy.